Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Educating on Snapchat. How you doing? So today we're going to be talking about Nebula. Going to be doing some first impressions of the card. Should be a pretty interesting one. I definitely think it's one of the more powerful cards we'll be getting in the season pass. Let's begin. So Nebula has each turn your opponent doesn't play a card here, +2 power, except the turn you play this. It's a 1 energy, 1 power card with the potential to scale +2 power every single turn that your opponent doesn't contest a card in that lane. So that is a crazy stat line, crazy power. Generally, 1-drops usually have around 2 to 3 power. Some 1-drops with big downsides have either 5 power or 7 power. Nebula can easily get 7 power and can be even higher if you do some synergies. If the opponent doesn't play a single card in that lane, right? You play Nebula on 1, well then you're on turn 2, right? You'll get 3 power, 5 power, 7 power, 9 power. And if you're getting more than that, I think the opponent isn't playing the game. So you can definitely go crazy with this. And I definitely feel that she's probably going to get adjusted in some way. I definitely think the way she currently stands is a little too free of power in a lot of cases. There is the downside, of course, that she's really only broken on turn 1. If you play her later on, then obviously a 1 power 3 card isn't that great, and a 1/1 is particularly bad. So there is that downside. However, most games that you're actually going to be playing, you get 3 cards, 4 cards at the beginning of the turn. That's a third of your deck, and a lot of the time, if you get her later, you're just not playing her. You're doing something else. So you're really only gonna you're gonna feel her mostly when she gets played on 1, and it definitely feels like a very problematic card to start comparing other 1-drops to. Fortunately, we are getting some other good 1-drops with Kitty Pryde coming up as well that everyone's gonna get. So there might be more options in the 1-drop spot to contest this, make this not as broken. But overall, my opinion in terms of whether you should buy this day 1 or whether I would buy it day 1, I definitely think this is a card I would experiment with day 1. So obviously we do the late game, the late stage full analysis to really evaluate whether the card should be bought. But if you're just willing to look for a good card for a day 1 purchase, this definitely feels like a card that you will be feeling good about as long as it doesn't get changed or adjusted in some way later on into the season. So definitely feels like a good card, a strong card. Let's start talking about some of the synergies for Nebula. So here we have a list of some common, or not common, but some of the synergies I think you can really utilize with Nebula. I think she really works best when you can mess with your opponent's lanes in some way, make it more annoying, make it more problematic for them to play a card. So things like Titania can jump to your opponent's side. That can really mess up with their space. Things like Green Goblin can really jump to their side, mess up this place. Polaris can move another card to that side. That kind of thing will just give them limited options, because something very powerful about Nebula is that even if your opponent plays contest that lane all 4 spots every turn, if you play Nebula on 1, you're still going to get that singular proc because they can only contest you 4 times. So even in best case scenarios, a lot of times for the opponent, they're still giving you a 1/3, which is really, really strong. So if you can make it 1 turn longer, well, then you get a 1/5. If you can make it 2 turns longer, that's a 1/7. So I definitely think you can make this card very problematic if you are messing with your opponents, finding it annoying. Another way is Magic. Magic could definitely be another tool of extending the game, giving your Nebula an extra 2 procs. That could be pretty easy. Professor X can also lock your opponent from playing into that lane in the final turn. It also scales in the Professor X lane, which is sometimes hard. So that's another way of really structuring that win in that particular lane. And then Sandman is something that just prevents your opponents from playing multiple cards. Then they're going to have to choose whether they want to invest in that Nebula lane or invest somewhere else in a more problematic lane. So you're just giving them less options to really do what they want to do, as well as Storm flooding a location. That's going to be a very common combo I think we're going to see with Nebula, just to make it very annoying and very easy for them to get that huge benefit. We also have Lizard. Lizard is just a strong card that gives your opponents 2 lanes of pressure to deal with, whether they want to invest heavily into the Lizard lane or invest heavily into the Nebula lane. Now you have a lot of flexibility in, do they want to give you power here or give you power there? And I think armor is going to be a pretty standard addition into Nebula. As soon as people start realizing how good they are, there's probably going to be destroy effects, Killmonger coming out left and right. So you're going to need that armor protection just to stay safe, just to feel strong about that and not really feel too worried about, last turn they could Killmonger and I'm going to lose that lane. As well as Goose and Mojo. Mojo being a way of capitalizing on them investing into your lane. You can play Mojo at 2 mana. 8 power card is going to be very devastating, as well as Goose limiting the amount of options that your opponent has to contest that lane. Nebula on 1, Goose on 2, Armor on 2. It's really going to make it difficult for them to easily contest there. So that's like the first page. We have another second page of Synergies to look at. This one really is more of the on reveal Galaxy of the Guardians Synergies, right? Rocket Raccoon, Star-Lord, Drax, Gamora, and Groot. Those all do get benefits from being in the same lane your opponent plays a card. Nebula is encouraging your opponents to play in that same lane, and you can really take advantage of the benefit to have some increased Guardian of the Galaxy cards. So that's definitely something you can do. Bass can definitely just slot into Nebula very easily. You're giving Nebula the extra buff ahead of schedule, and a lot of decks already use Bass, so it's not too bad. Ebony Maw I like, because what you can do with Ebony Maw is you play Nebula and Ebony Maw in the same lane, and then you're basically fully contesting that lane for 2 mana, right? It's going to be hard for your opponents to really win that lane without heavily investing tons of energy into that lane, because you're presenting like 10, 15, well, not 15, but like 10, 11, 13 types of power with 2 mana is so rough. And you can still affect that lane if you're playing some type of reaching deck with a Doctor Doom or something like that. So that's definitely a cool combo. You're going to have to be aware of maybe protecting with an armor. So it'd be maybe turn 3, you'd play the Nebula, or turn 3, you'd play the Ebony Maw. Turn 2, you'd play the armor. You do want to invest there. And then I think it's a pretty powerful combo to just invest so much for so little. And then Debris kind of is the same strategy. You're blocking more spaces, you're giving them less opportunities to play cards in the Nebula lane. It's a lot easier for you to get that proc. Then Arrow and Dr. Octopus. Arrow moves a card out of the way, so that can definitely kind of prevent the proc from happening. I actually don't know, to be fair. I didn't put Juggernaut in here because I don't know if the opponent plays a card and then you Juggernaut it away or Stegron it away, does it still proc? My thought process is that it would still negate the Nebula effect. So I wonder if it has to be revealed for it to matter. And if you can arrow it away, I'm not 100% sure on that. But if you can, that would be a good way to deal with it. And then Dr. Octopus, you fill that lane, and then your Nebula starts proccing and proccing and proccing. So those are some of the synergies you can do with this card. I do think that it's generally a very flexible card. It's a 1-drop that has good scaling. You don't really need to build a deck around it. It's just a good card when you play it. So I definitely think a lot of decks will just use it just as their maybe preferential one drop of choice, maybe moving away from Sunspot or something like that. And you'll just have Nebula be a very good win condition, or not a win condition, but a good threat for your games. Now I want to talk about some of the downsides, some of the weaknesses of Nebula. I think Killmonger is the one that jumps out to a lot of people, like, ooh, I'm going to play Killmonger this season, haha, because of Nebula. Yes, I think that's a good idea, first of all. But I also want to talk about Electra. I feel like this card is just underutilized, and I think with Kitty coming out and with Nebula coming out at the same time, definitely think Electra could jump and be a very valuable tool for you to play with. See if you can make decks that can take advantage of the body, take advantage of the low base power, maybe a Bass deck or something like that. And that can really be a good tool for you to have. Now, I also want to talk about Kitty Pryde. Everyone's getting this card for free. And this is a really good counter into Nebula, right? I think if people start saying Nebula isn't that good, it might be because they're playing into Kitty Pryde decks. Because what can happen is you play the Nebula, your opponent plays the Kitty Pryde goes back into their hand, they see that you have the Nebula, they play the Kitty Pryde in the same lane again, goes back to their hand, then they have that free spot, they play it into the lane again, goes back to their hand. So you just have a way to completely deny your Nebula unless you have some type of Storm Synergy or something like that. So that could be a pretty problematic thing that happens where you think, oh, I got a good scenario to use the Nebula, but then the Kitty Pryde from your opponent just shuts that down completely. So that could be a really interesting mechanic that makes Nebula not feel as good as normally she would be, because we didn't really have a card like that you could just keep playing and playing and playing to kind of negate a Nebula effect. So I don't know if a lot of people are thinking about that and thinking and evaluating the card with that in mind, but that's definitely something you want to be aware of, that hey, a lot of people are going to have Kitty Pryde might be a very good matchup into the Nebula. Then Shadow King, it's a lot cheaper now, and I think it might be more viable. There's a lot of cards that do get buffed, and Shadow King can really mess with that, as well as there's a tendency of not playing as many ongoings now because of the Enchantress buff. You might see more decks relying on something other than ongoing, which was a major weakness for Shadow King before. So this might be like a good opportunity to really sneak some wins with a Shadow King if you haven't been trying to utilize that card so far. So definitely think that could be a really good tool for you. And then Thanos, I think, has a pretty easy time playing cards into a Nebula lane. All those 1-cost stones are going to be very easy to just willy-nilly play down there, willy-nilly play. And if you're playing like a Thanos deck or any deck like running Carnage or something, it can be very easy to keep playing more cards into that particular lane. So definitely think Thanos is like a unique counter, but it's a counter that makes sense in principle with how a lot of Thanos decks want to play. They don't really care if they're stacking a particular lane as long as they have removal for those stones if need be. So definitely think overall that it's a pretty strong card. It does have some weaknesses, but you can mitigate a lot of it with armor. And the Kitty Pryde thing still needs to be fleshed out. We don't know how common Kitty Pryde will be and how many decks will be running that. So it might be a problem, it might not. We're not too sure. And then some of the other counters are a little bit more niche. So I did, against better judgment, make some example builds, some deck builds. I really shy away from that because we don't know how good a card will be and how it will interact and stuff like that. But I was feeling inspirational today, so decided to build 3 decks that I particularly like or am comfortable with. Maybe you want to try it or get inspiration from it and go. I definitely want to start that Nebula can be played in a ton of decks. So many decks, right? So you don't have to say, oh, I have to play it in this particular deck, but these are some of the archetypes that I came up with. So the first one we have is the Storm Control archetype. I think Nebula fits in pretty well because it's very easy to just play Nebula, play Storm, play your 4-drop, and then boom, you're good to go in terms of having that win condition online. And alternatively, the one thing, oh, this is supposed to be armor or not. This could be armor. I will say the one thing you could do is change one of the 2-drops to armor if you need to, if you're really feeling that pressure. I definitely want to mention that the armor could definitely be something. I do think Nebula into Goose is pretty cool. I also think Nebula into Lizard is pretty cool, right? You play a Lizard in a different lane, so they have 2 lanes to work on. I also think Green Goblin is just generally a good card to kind of mess with your opponents. But I definitely want to mention that armor could be in here very, very easily. So let me do this real quick. Put a armor in and say, yeah, this is definitely a viable, in my opinion, build. We're not going to know if it's actually viable. And then I have the Dr. Doom at the end, just in case your opponent can still reach into that lane to have that finisher, have that extra 5 power. It's going to be really hard to win that Storm location with the Dr. Doom finish. And you have the scaling with the Sunspot because our cards are usually pretty cheap. So that's definitely an idea I came up with. You're really taking the Storm control and then adding a few tools to make it feel better for Nebula. Next up, this is more of a junk control heavy deck. This one's definitely more focused on the giving your opponents less locations to play at and really messing with them. So we have the Nebula, we have the armor, but we're now giving them a ton more cards with the debris, with the Viper, and just taking advantage of that. You have the Mojo, because it's going to be very easy to fill all the lanes. You have the Daredevil. Daredevil could be something else. You could, regardless. Like, Daredevil is not the most necessary card. It's just safer to play because you know exactly what your opponent's going to do. And then you have the Professor X and the Spider-Woman for your finishes there. So definitely a pretty nice junk deck. If you like playing junk, if you like messing with your opponents, this is something that could definitely work in the new metagame. And then last off, we have the Electro ramp kind of wave variant where we're taking advantage of the Sandman to kind of be that limiting factor, and you have some really powerful early game tools so that if you have that early game going, then you can finish it out with the Electro into Sandman into Doom Odin combo or whatever late game scenario you want to play out. But your early game is just very solid. Sunspot and Nebula and Ebony Maw into armor is just so hard to beat. And then you just have all of the little finishes there to really give you options and how you want to play the end of the game. So these are some of the ideas I came up with. I want to say you can play Nebula in a lot of things, like Zoo, whatever you want. If you can put a 1-drop in there, you can probably put Nebula in. So definitely think it's a card that's going to see play. Definitely think a lot of Killmongers are going to be in the game because of Nebula and Kitty Pryde, right? You also have to remember Kitty Pryde is also being added. So we'll see, but those are my first impressions. I do recommend the card. I do think it's going to be good. We'll see if it gets nerfed in some way, because it does feel a little too good in my opinion, but they have the stats. I don't. Obviously, I haven't seen the card at all, but hopefully you guys enjoy this. Hope you guys learned something, and I'll see you in the next one.
Educated calling snap. Once you watch him, you won't go back. He'll teach you to marvel snap. Your skills will be improving. How you doing? You'll hit infinity and won't go back. Educated calling snap.